Welcome to Real Time Review. I'm your host, Jesse Nussman. With me again, fellow Atlanta film critic, Jason Evans.
Good to be here.
Jason, I'm very excited about this week's episode. This week's very special episode because we get to talk about the Coen brothers.
Geniuses, yes.
Yeah, which means a lot to me because I'm someone who grew up like an avid fan of them. But what's your relationship with Joel and Ethan Coen?
Oh man, I mentioned to you before we came on that I wanted to make a point about Joel and Ethan Coen. Think about the number of careers that they have launched. I mean, it is not a stretch to say John Goodman, Holly Hunter, John Turturro, Oscar Isaac. I mean, Haley Steinfeld. I could go on and on with the important Frances McDormand.
Yeah.
You know what? I can't even think of all of them. But for a long stretch of time, if you were in a Coen Brothers film as an actor, you knew that you were going to get a directors, I guess, who would pull a great performance out of you, and it would really change your career. These are people who went on to be huge, huge stars. I don't know that any of them have the same career trajectory without Fargo and Raising Arizona and on and on and on.
And even then you got people like John Turturro and John Goodman and, you know, Jeff Bridges, that like some of their most iconic work is
no question
working with these guys.
Jeff Bridges especially, like the renaissance that his career's had over the past like two decades is almost exclusively Coen Brothers films.
And he just became that guy.
Yeah.
Like he went from like heartthrob actor to basically just becoming the dude in real life.
Yeah.
I really love the Coen Brothers. I feel like growing up as like a young cinephile, they were like one of those filmmakers, or in this case, filmmaking duo that like was very attractive for like my friends and I, because they not only made these like contemporary, very entertaining movies, but they kind of had like one foot in old Hollywood and kind of reaching back into like, you know, screwball comedies and noirs from like the 40s and old westerns, and just kind of a way to kind of discover a whole bunch of other different movies, as well as because the Coen brothers are in interviews very vague and are oftentimes very confrontational and kind of dismissive about the idea of people reading anything into their movies. They probably think what we're doing right now is incredibly stupid and a waste of our time. That makes their movies like very open to different interpretations, and you can go on so many different rabbit holes with all of them. And I can't think of too many filmmakers in which like, you know, you could go through almost every single one of their movies and like you could write basically like an entire like thesis essay, like breaking down all of the different like literary references and references to old Hollywood movies and kind of what the structure of them has to say. But we're talking about them this week because Ethan Coen actually has a new movie out.
Can I ask, can we wait a second? Because we're doing our Coen Brothers thing now.
Yeah.
Let's do that before we hit.
But you don't want to end on a high note?
Oh, maybe you're right. Okay.
Let's end on a high note.
Continue. All right, you're fine.
So Joel and Ethan Coen have kind of briefly split up in the last few years and have done these separate projects with their wives. Joel Coen did the adaptation of Macbeth with Frances McDormand and Denzel Washington.
Could not be like darker, more serious. Like if we've ever wondered what are the Coen individual, you know, what are their individual personalities, the film projects they've picked since they split apart starts to tell us something.
Right, like maybe indicates Joel is the one that's like, I'm reading old like Raymond Chandler crime novels, and like Ethan Coen's the funny one. Because his project that he did with his wife is this movie DriveAway Dolls that's coming out this week, about two young lesbian women who go on a road trip and they encounter a suitcase of mysterious things that
we are not going to spoil what's in that suitcase.
We won't spoil for multiple reasons, but it's essentially this kind of wild, crazy road trip sex comedy. And I'm curious, what did you think about this movie? Because I kind of gauging everyone else when we walked out, like there were some very pointed takes, I think, of people walking out of it.
I really wanted to like it, and it has a number of moments. And I think one of the things the Coens do so great is I think they draw out interesting performances. They put you in the head of the characters really, really well. It's one of the, to me, that might be the greatest thing that they do as directors, is that you feel like you're inhabiting, you know, at least the headspace of the characters on screen. And this film has a lot of that, and I like that. That said, like the plot is ridiculous, and there are a number of like quirky things that they do in the film that I say they, sorry, it's just Ethan Coen, I really didn't enjoy. For example, one of them, and I almost feel guilty saying this, the film is aggressively lesbian. I mean, let's be clear about that. And I have no problem with different types of sexuality depicted on screen. I'm not going to get into any of that kind of stuff. But in this film, I don't think there's a female character who isn't, like, again, a very aggressive lesbian.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just a little strange. I was a little bit like, why are you making this movie?
That's fair. Yeah.
I'm not going to necessarily judge whether or not it depicts lesbians in a positive or negative fashion, but the fact that I'm even questioning that is problematic, I think, a little bit, especially because it's not coming from a director who themselves identifies as a lesbian. And I don't know, there's just a lot about it. The crime caper sort of thing that crops up toward the end, I was just like, this is ridiculous. None of this feels realistic.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, the Coens, look, Oh Brother, We're Out There is not a realistic film.
Right.
A lot of the
they've
films
done plenty of these kind of like cartoonish manic comedies. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, Raising Arizona, The Big Lebowski,
Absolutely.
which kind of like, you know, the characters are just sort of wandering from sort of strange scenario to strange scenario, and it's just sort of like a vague roadmap that just get us to like a bunch of kind of comedic set pieces.
And this film has a lot of that. I just don't think it executes it nearly as well as those other classics do. I don't think the scenes come off nearly as funny. Some of them come off as frankly kind of mean. And I don't feel like Ethan had as much to say. You talked about you could write a paper about it. There's no way you could write a paper about this. There just isn't that much happening in this film from an intellectual standpoint.
Yeah, I'm sort of, this movie's like a weird quagmire for me, because watching it as a Coen Brothers fan, like, it both feels of a piece, but also like is missing certain aspects that I think make their movies great. Like, it has the kind of like rapid fire double talk dialogue that a lot of their movies have.
You can see the script as a Coen Brothers script,
right.
for sure.
It feels, as I said, like very linked to kind of like some of their more cartoonish movies like Raising Arizona, and it has kind of like the crime caper elements to it.
Like Fargo,
yeah, and the range of comedy. I mean, once we get into some of our favorite movies, what I love is like the Coens will give you like highbrow literary reference jokes, but then they'll also give you like, you know, juvenile locker room jokes too, and it somehow all works in the same thing. This movie, it maybe feels
speaking of juvenile, there are more dildos in this film than I think I've seen on camera in a long time. Again, no problem with it.
Nope.
That's just, it's a choice.
But something does kind of feel weirdly off in this movie, and I think it makes it sort of like an interesting text to analyze as like a Coen Brothers fan, but one that maybe feels like a little disappointing, like leaving it. I had a better time at it than you did. There were like some of the moments where I was like, this feels quintessentially Coen and like is hilariously funny, and I enjoyed bits of it, but there is something about kind of the general tone and vibe and even kind of like the craftsmanship of the movie that's not quite up to their usual standard, and something that you can't quite put your finger on feels a little off in this movie. I even think it's sort of interesting that this is like trying to be a somewhat political movie about America today, that you normally don't think of the Coen Brothers making movies like that, so it being interesting that that is something that Ethan is clearly interested in that maybe Joel is less interested in. It's an interesting movie to talk about, but one that I think kind of walking out was not that successful.
I think audiences aren't going to be, this is not going to be a big box office kind of hit. You're talking about, you know, it's tough to put your finger on the thing that was off. Like, one of the things that bothered me was throughout the entire film, one of the main characters puts on a southern accent that sounds like she's trying to mimic George Clooney's character from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Margot Qualley doing this.
And it's just it's so over the top as an accent that I said connecting with the characters is what the Coen Brothers do so great. I couldn't connect with her character because every time she spoke, I was like, are you know, did Ethan tell you listen to George Clooney's entire performance and mimic that? Or did you do this on your own? It's weird. It's strange.
So let's talk about our favorite Coen Brothers films.
Yeah,
much better way to spend our time.
Exactly.
You and I share two of them, Fargo and The Big Lebowski. Fargo probably, you know, is it the entryway movie of like the one you would reference to people? Like if you've never seen a Coen Brothers movie, like Fargo, entertaining crime thriller, but also gives you kind of a bit of their sense of humor that can guide you into some of the weirder comedies.
Fargo is such an easy movie to watch because it has those lighter moments, but at the same time, it is a really engaging and interesting crime thriller, as you put it. And that's one of those films, again, where I feel like you get in the head. When William H. Macy is at the car dealership and he's on the phone with the folks from the financing.
Right.
I'm not going to get into all the aspects of what's going on there, but his conversations feel so true, feel so genuine. I am there with him. I understand exactly what he's trying to pull off, a scam. He's trying to delay things long enough so he can get, it's so easy, I think, from the standpoint of the audience to understand what's happening. And that's a real gift. That's not something you get in every film.
And I think with the comedy too, like it finds this fun balance of the Coens, both Midwest guys, kind of making fun of like small town Midwest folks, but also like it doesn't feel cruel in a sense. I feel like the Coens,
it's endearing. Yeah.
I feel like the Coens sometimes get this sort of bad reputation for being like cruel to their characters or hating their characters, but I think Fargo is an example of like there's a great deal of humanity and warmth for their characters just as much as like they're kind of making fun of silly voices or buffoonish behavior.
Yeah, the accents in that film are they're great, and you're right. I mean, I just sat here and I told you about an accent that bothered me throughout the film. Francis McDormand, none of the accents bother me at all in that movie because you feel like they do love the characters.
So for me, Big Lebowski is my personal favorite, and I think it might be the funniest movie I've ever seen. Like it is one of those movies that no matter how many times
I'm not going to go that far, but it is.
No matter how many times I've seen it, there is something new that like I had not picked up on, and I think for as much as that movie gets this reputation as this kind of like college film bro like dorm room poster of it's just sort of this shaggy stoner comedy, like it's an insanely smart movie that just like the level of jokes that they're able to pack into every single little moment, and as I said, like everything from sort of like broad physical kind of like locker room comedy to jokes about Lenin and like the Soviet Revolution and stuff that like you pick up on after seeing it several
5 different
times.
levels for every scene.
Right.
The characters are so weird and quirky, and yet we love them so. I mean, John Turturro is barely in the film, and they made a sequel about just his character,
right?
Because it's such a compelling character.
So 2 others that are on our list that are different, but I think could be paired together. You had True Grit on your list, and I had No Country for Old Men, which I feel like
they're both westerns.
Yeah,
mine's a classic western. Yours is a modern western.
But also, I think movies that are them kind of perfectly paired, like a peanut butter chocolate scenario with material that is just like that they meet the material on its face, but also can like help enrich in it and can underline what's great about it. With Cormac McCarthy in the case of No Country for Old Men. Yeah. Or True Grit is based off of a great novel, and they're kind of they're both great examples of I think like them as filmmakers meeting material that really plays to their strengths, and as you said, are both these 2 set in completely different time periods, but these kind of like grand sweeping westerns. True Grit a bit more humanist than I'd say like No Country for Old Men leaves you kind of like
bleak a little bit,
pretty bad about the state of the world at the end. I want to give you a chance to talk about the other 2 on your list, Raising Arizona and Miller's Crossing, which are both 2 of their kind of earlier films.
Yeah, and I don't know that I need to get into Raising Arizona a lot. I think it's the film that really introduced the Coen brothers to the entire world to a large extent. It introduced us to Holly Hunter. I think it's one of Nick Cage's best performances of his career. Such a funny film, and I think the thing that leaps out at you when you watch that movie is their use, their ability to put the camera in unusual places, and as I was talking about earlier, by doing that, taking you into the scene in a way that I think very few directors are able to achieve. And it's such a funny movie. You understand where every character is coming from at every moment. Love that
It's a
film.
live-action Looney Tunes cartoon,
It is.
but there's also just such a like fun joy part of it. Like you mentioning putting the camera in weird places. Like there's all these fun stories of them like strapping cameras to like 2x4s and throwing the 2x4 and stuff.
And just other crazy stuff. They weren't experienced enough to know that's never going to work, and so it did work.
Right.
That's what's great.
There's a fun in the fun of filmmaking that they're having with it. I'm very interested to hear you talk about Miller's Crossing, which I think is kind of their most underrated movie. Like I feel like this is one not too many people have seen, but it's really good.
I'll be honest. One of the reasons I put it on my list was I wanted to remind people that this is out there. It is a quintessential gangster movie, and it features just a couple great. Gabriel Byrne is fabulous, and John Turturro, who feels like is in almost every Coen Brothers movie, is in it. It's just one of these films that it takes a couple different twists and turns. The characters are faced with real moral questions. The fact that they did this which is really a humor-free movie. And it's a very violent film. The fact that they made that film so soon on the backs of Raising Arizona, this was them saying, we are more than just the crazy, quirky guys who toss our camera all over the place. This is them saying we are serious filmmakers who can tell really, dark, compelling stories. And I think it sets the stage for them to do stuff like Fargo and some of the other, No Country for Old Men later on. Their ability to do those films is because of what they achieved with Miller's Crossing. That a film that when you sit down and really start to watch it, you'll be drawn in, and the ending just packs a huge punch.
Oh yeah. Also a movie I would recommend people put their subtitles on for it.
Yeah.
Not because it's hard to hear, but because like
there's some accents. There's some stuff going on.
Or even I was going to say the dialogue is so good in this movie and is so kind of poetic and is very like literary in the way that it's written. Like just the use of prose that they have in the movie that just like, I would just encourage people if you watch it, like put the subtitles on, and that even gives you like an even greater appreciation for how wondrous the dialogue is in that movie.
Absolutely.
My two picks, I'm going to get very borderline emotional here for a second because there's two movies that are very personal to me. I put A Serious Man and Inside Llewyn Davis. A Serious Man starring Michael Stuhlbarg as a kind of neurotic professor who feels his life is kind of falling apart all around him and seeks guidance in the spiritual leaders at the synagogue that he goes to, and is really, I think it rivals The Big Lebowski as maybe their funniest movie, and it's a comedy all about the kind of like the notion of ambiguity and like this idea of like us living in a world where you're like, why are bad things happening to me? And you like turn to your religious leaders, you turn to God, you turn to science, whatever.
And there are no easy answers.
There's no easy answers. And like that's the whole idea of the movie, like isn't giving you easy answers for stuff, but it's just kind of mounting this like increasing comedic frustration of this guy who's trying so hard to sort of just get like, somebody tell me what I need to be doing to kind of like make my life okay. And it just spirals further and further out of control. And that's a very like relatable thing. Like I've dealt with that feeling in my life. I'm sure tons of other people have dealt with that feeling and kind of able to take this kind of dark existential crisis that a lot of us as people deal with and turn it into this manic, crazy comedy, I think is kind of brilliant. And even Inside Llewyn Davis has a little bit of that too, of Oscar Isaac as this folk singer who maybe he's, there's a way you can look at the movie as he's really, really talented, but he's just like, he doesn't get luck.
He can't get out of his own way.
You need luck in order to make it in the music business. Or you can read it as, this is a guy who's really, really talented, but he's self-sabotaging himself because he's kind of just a jerk and he doesn't know how to collaborate with people, and them never coming down on one side of that debate and you as an audience having to struggle with both kind of like, okay, the same ideas of why do bad things, why does unlucky things happen in our life? But then, also for me, it's a movie I can watch and be like, I don't know if you have this relationship with any movies where you're like, I know that this person is potentially me on my worst day. Like, I can't help but watch Inside Llewyn Davis and be like, I cannot become the Oscar Isaac character because I know from friends and family that I have been like this at certain times in my life. And that, I think, just makes my appreciation for it all the greater and all the richer, is because I think I see in both of those movies kind of a connection to real personal fears and anxieties that I've had throughout my life and that I know other friends and family members have had, and yet they find a way to make it kind of like wondrous and funny and manic, and it I think makes those movies really, really special to me.
Look, both of those films I think are a great example of the point I was making earlier about the Coen brothers doing a great job of putting you in the head, putting you in the space of a character that you might otherwise not be able to relate to. One of the films that isn't in my top 5 that I think does a great job of that is Barton Fink. And I can't recommend that anyone actually watch it. It is an excruciating film because it is about writer's block. But as someone who writes, I sat there watching the movie.
It's so painfully accurate.
I sat there watching the movie and was like, oh my God, how did they know this is me?
Yes.
And I went to that film with my wife, and when it ended, she's not a writer. When it ended, she said to me, I'm never seeing another Coen Brothers movie again. I think there are a lot of people who, look, A Serious Man and Inside Llewyn Davis, these are not films that were big commercial hits because they are challenging, super challenging, and you are going along for a ride with a character that even though you may recognize
You may
yourself in
find
it,
the character insufferable at the end of the
Yes.
day, but there's something like compelling about them and the
Yes.
way that they're able to render them as fully three-dimensional people that is so unique.
And I think I'm glad that we're talking about these films. This is really the genius of the Coen brothers, and I wish there was a little more of it in DriveAway Dolls.
I would agree. Jason, thank you again for stopping by this week. Next week, our audience can be very excited because Dune is finally arriving. And, Tegna got back to us, and we're going to be able to put sand all in here.
I love it.
We'll have worms and all of that. But until then, we'll see you at the movies.